Hi, I'm Jeff, this is Tropical Plants at 53 degrees north, and today we're going to discuss this stuff, COIR, and in particular its use with carnivorous plants. So let's jump in. And we are in. Okay, so I've put the COIR block here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. My heater just kicked in. We'll just have to put up with that because it's very, very cold outside. Still snow on the ground. So I'm pointing at this because this is my tray of budding seeds. Well, they're not budding yet, but the seedlings, hopefully to be. This was from my video that I did a few days ago on growing Drosera Regia, the King Sundew. Now, if you caught that video, you might have seen that I've never used COIR before, and as well as telling you quite a bit about Drosera Regia and how I was going to sow them, and I followed the instructions from the guy who sold them to me, I also thought I'd try my hand at using something that was more sustainable, i.e. COIR. So what you've got there is you've got some COIR mixed with some perlite and topped with some sphagnum moss, and on top of that we've got some Drosera Regia seeds sown and then kind of compressed down a little bit. And the plan is that once they come up and the roots go down into the COIR, I will then be able to transplant them into something else. So the general idea with carnivorous plants is that they do not like to be in any kind of media that contains salts, minerals, nutrition of any sort. And this is why peat is generally used. And a lot of carnivorous plants actually come from peat bog areas. Now, up until now, I've used sphagnum peat moss, which is just an ordinary peat that comes from, in particular, the remains of sphagnum. And it takes a long time to produce those peat bogs. And the peat that results from that actually creates a habitat. And I'm sure lots of people know that this habitat is quite endangered at the moment because of the use of peat in general horticulture practice. So it's not just people who grow carnivorous plants that use peat. Lots of plants like the material, and lots of plants benefit from using it in the soil and also in pots. But as we know, it's not sustainable because it takes so long for these habitats to be created and relatively short amount of time for them to be destroyed. Hence, it's always a good idea for us to, as gardeners, try and come up with another way, or something that's more sustainable anyway, and this is where COIR comes in. So, because I'd never used it before, I thought to myself, right, well, what I'll do, I will do a little bit of research and see if carnivorous plants will grow in COIR. So I reached out to a few people. One was on Instagram, and I think it was Red Leaf Exotics actually, who are quite a well-known grower and seller in the States, and they said, yes, of course you can use COIR. You can use it for Nepenthes, you can use it for Drosera, you can use it for various carnivorous plants in place of peat. Anything, in fact, that would use peat, you can use COIR instead. I also noticed that Monty Don on Gardener's World, BBC's Gardener's World, has also used COIR on numerous occasions and recommends it as a peat substitute. So, Red Leaf Exotics actually did point out that it needs washing, but because I reached out to them quite a while back and then there was a bit of a break in between, I totally forgot that bit. And I therefore pinned a comment to my last video on sowing the Drosera Regia seeds to say that it needs washing. I've since done a little bit more research, so what I want to do is go into a little bit more depth about COIR and talk about some of the problems and why it needs washing and whether there are any other potential issues and what I'm going to do about it. So first of all, why do we use COIR? Well, we've already talked about the sustainability or non-sustainability of using peat. So we need something else that would be easily sustainable. There's lots of it around, and it doesn't destroy any habitats, and that's where this stuff comes in. So COIR comes from coconut. It comes from not only the coconut husks, so you'll see various types of this for sale. You'll see the shells, you'll see the coconut husks, like the chopped outer casing of the coconut, but this I believe comes from the pith, so it's a little bit more towards the centre of the coconut, or maybe a little bit underneath the shell, hard shell of the coconut. And it's compressed, it's dehydrated, and it's sent off like this. that makes it really useful because it's very, very transportable. It's not that heavy, and it's really easy then to rehydrate that, which I'll do another video on, but it's very easy to do. You basically just add water to it. But I've read all sorts of various commenters talking about whether it needs to be warm, it needs to be this, it needs to be that, and it's really a lot more simple than people make out. But again, as I say, I'll make another video on that. So some of the other benefits of using COIR is that what it does is, when it's fluffed up material, it looks very much like peat, but not only does it hold on to moisture, but it keeps the air around, or it allows air around the roots, which is something that many substrates don't actually do. So I know for sure that sphagnum moss can actually create quite a hard, compact outer casing, which could be an issue. So I'll just take you through to the cooler side and I'll show you one of the potential issues. Now again, this is just theory at the moment, but this Oncidium twinkle up here, even though it's looking very nice with its blooms, this is twinkle cinnamon, you'll notice that the leaves aren't looking that wonderful. We've got all these black markings on them. And the theory put forward by one of my subscribers, and I'm sure other people as well, is that this sphagnum moss here, I've put quite a heavy sphagnum moss bed on there, and you can actually feel quite a hard surface to it. And the idea is that perhaps these roots just aren't getting the air around them that they need, and that might be what's causing the spotting. So I'm going to test that. I'm going to actually unmount that one, and I'm going to try it in some COIR and see what happens. I'll also notice that there are actually no new growth coming on that at the moment. So as soon as these blooms start to drop, I'm going to unmount it and give it a test and see what happens. So that's one of the benefits of COIR. So we said it's easily transportable. It's sustainable, it allows that airflow around the roots, it lasts longer before decomposing, so when it's in a pot it will last much longer. We've said it doesn't harm peat bogs. It's also sterile, so what you don't get that you do get, or you could get in peat, is that you don't get any of those pathogens and viruses and various things, bacteria and so on, that you would normally get, that you might want to eradicate before you actually use on your plants. Maybe some people do. I have to say I'm not that great with plant hygiene. I do tend to take a risk because I feel that when they're out in the wild they've got to cope with these things. But I understand why people do it. You know, they pay a lot of money for plants and they want them to last, and they don't want to take any chances that that plant's going to get any kind of pathogen. So those are the main benefits for using COIR. So I thought to myself, right, well, it's a good idea. I'll try it and see if I can reduce my consumption of peat. In fact, I want to try and completely eradicate my use of peat, because I use peat with other plants as well, and I really don't want to be using that kind of material when I know what it does to the planet. Okay, so that's the reasoning behind it. So to keep on with the story, I went ahead and instead of using peat, I used the COIR in the media for my seeds there. Okay, so what happened then was, as I was flicking through various pieces of information on various media that you can use for carnivorous plants, I came across some kind of a forum where people were talking about washing the COIR. And then that kind of triggered a little thing in my memory about the guy from Red Leaf Exotics talking about washing the COIR. So I then did a little bit of research, and to my horror, I discovered that very often, in fact, pretty much all the time, this stuff is not only grown near the sea, which is pretty obvious really if it's a coconut, but it's also washed in the seawater. Now, the problem with that is that it raises the salt and mineral content inside the COIR blocks, and obviously inside the resulting material that you use for your media, by rather a large amount. Now, that might not be an issue if you're using it outside on plants like vegetable patches and plants in the garden, but it certainly is an issue if you're using it on carnivorous plants, because they do not like to sit in anything that has any kind of high salt content. You would also find that for orchids and the like. They don't like to sit in anything that has a high salt content. So, cut a long story short, the recommended procedure is to wash it. Okay, so over here I have got a bucket full of the coir that I created, and I've now poured a load of water in it. I've left it overnight. I'm going to drain that water off, and then I'm going to use a TDS meter to see what the salt content is. Now, I've jumped ahead a step there because, as usual with these kind of things, I like to test these things out myself. So what I did was I got a little orchid pot full of this stuff, this coir, and I poured some water through it. It was actually some RO water, because obviously I don't want the water initially to have any kind of high TDS reading. And the reading of the RO water was about 8 or 9, which is obviously very low. I then drained it into a container, and I discovered that the TDS reading of my coir block was actually about 450 parts per million. Now, I read various sources online that said sometimes people are finding that it's 1,000, 1,500 parts per million and upwards of that. Now, if you are growing carnivorous plants, you really want it to be, again, many people said below 50, some said below 70, some said below 80. So I would say anything between 50 and 80 and you're pretty okay, you're going to be okay. But mine obviously read 450, which is not going to be good for these seeds to grow in. Now, it remains to be seen whether they will actually germinate. I would expect them to germinate, bearing in mind that they are very small seeds and they're mostly in the sphagnum at the moment. The issue will come when they go down into the coir. Now, it's not like I can change that now, so this will be a little bit of an experiment. I'm hoping to actually get to them before it causes too many problems. As soon as they are big enough to prick out, then I will take them out and I will get them into something with a much lower salt content. If all else fails, I will have to buy some more seeds if they don't survive. By the way, it is worth pointing out that all is not lost. If your plants do get in some kind of substrate where there is a high salt content, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will die straight away. The guy from Red Leaf Exotics said that certainly on the Nepenthes, you might get some spotting on leaves, you might get some mutations in the growth, but because Nepenthes grow so slowly anyway, it's not going to happen overnight. So you can always change it as soon as you see something happening. So all is not lost. We're not talking about major disaster here, but obviously we all want to grow our plants to the best of our ability and for them to grow as quickly and healthily as possible. So once I discovered that my coir that I used had an TDS reading of over 400, I've then set about trying to rectify that by washing it through. Some people talked about having to wash it through 8 or 9 times before it actually got the TDS reading low enough to be able to use it with the carnivorous plants. At the moment, I'm just using rainwater in there, which would be fine, except my rainwater, because it comes off a garage roof, tends to have a higher TDS reading anyway of about 80 to 100 parts per million. It takes me so long to actually make some RO water over there using the filter. To fill that, in fact, it can take a full day to fill that, so I'm not using that just yet. I'm going to use the rainwater for the most part, and as soon as I can get that TDS reading down, then I'll use the RO water, hopefully only once, but maybe more than that, so we'll see. So the question is it worth doing it this way? Well, in my case, I think it is, because it's not been difficult for me to pour some rainwater in there. I'm certainly not lacking rainwater. That's pretty much all we've got around here. So I'll keep pouring it in. I'm going to empty that out today, and let's see how long it takes. Obviously, if your initial reading is going to be a lot higher, then it's going to take you more goes. The coir that I used was supposedly already washed and didn't contain any salt, but don't always take their word for it, because again, I've seen many sources claim that they're allowed to put that it's washed if it's just been out in the rain. And okay, you can see the difference. Maybe mine has been washed, but even so, it's still going to be too high. 450 is too high for orchids, and it's too high for carnivorous plants. It probably isn't too high for most other plants, and that's obviously what they're going to mean in that case when they say it's pre-washed. So that's just a little bit of a warning to people. If you are going to consider using coir, if you're an orchid grower, if you're a carnivorous plant grower, then it's well worth remembering that you really will need to wash it through and try and get that TDS down. Once that's done, once this bucket is done, I'll have enough media there to last me probably for the entire year, because I don't think I'm going to be doing that much repotting on carnivorous plants, certainly for a while, and I've still got another 6 blocks in the other side of the greenhouse waiting to be dehydrated. So I do think it's worth it. For me anyway, it's going to be worth it. It's not a real big process. I might have to do this several times, but once it's done, and that bucket will last me quite a long time. So I just thought I'd point out what one or two other people have pointed out to me in my search for an alternative to peat, and I hope that's useful to somebody. I know some people already know this stuff. If you do, great. If you don't, then maybe that's something you can think about for the future. If we can even convert one person to using COIR instead of using peat, then obviously that's going to help in the long run. So please let me know in the comments anything that you found useful or anything that you can add to the conversation on COIR. And for now, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.